Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Kelley Vlahos, who is here from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and she's here to talk about some of the architects of the Iraq War you might not have heard of, the neocons, some of their influence today, even up to the policies in Ukraine. Kelley previously came on to speak about the media's role in Iraq and some of her personal experiences when she used to work for Fox's website, was it? But it's great to have you again here today, Kelley. How are you doing?
Great, Louis. Thanks for having me on again.
No problem. So, for people who have never heard of them, I know people have probably heard it enough, but many people outside of America or within my age group may have no idea who the neocons are or the neoconservatives or kind of the influence they had around the Iraq invasion. So, first of all, can you just please tell people who the neocons are and kind of what their ideology is?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how far you want me to go back, but I think the general conventional wisdom or history about the neoconservatives is they actually came from a liberal political background. Actually, anti-communists. Irving Kristol, who is Bill Kristol's father, was one of the major purveyors of neoconservatism. These are folks who had liberal ideologies on domestic politics, but when it came to foreign policy, had found themselves more in line with the Reagan anti-communist foreign policy, a very, I would say, assertive peace through strength strategy for foreign policy. And you saw this all through the 80s with the anti-communist proxy wars that the Reagan administration had fueled and funded all through Latin America, the very assertive primacist role that the United States military played in the Middle East. And this group had gained a lot of status and influence in Washington through intellectual institutions, academic institutions like Johns Hopkins SAIS, International School of Studies, and started replacing a lot of the old guard, what you would call the more consensus foreign policy, greatest generation guys, starting, late 80s, early 90s, and had set about to, pursue plans to more or less pursue a very primacist role for the United States, particularly in the Middle East, to control what they said any power that became too big, too hegemonic, and do this through military force. There was a group of these guys who became very influential on Capitol Hill, beginning with Paul Wolfowitz, and he had a deputy at the time when Paul Wolfowitz was Defense Undersecretary of Defense, and Scooter Libby, a famous name from the post 9/11 days, was his deputy, and they had come up with this defense planning guidance. And this was during, I believe, I want to say the first Bush administration. And this sort of reflected a lot of these plans that the neoconservatives had, but it was pretty panned, I would say, generally by the broader foreign policy establishment. Well, what they did was they ended up toning down the language in that H.W. Bush White House, but then basically taking their project aside. And I don't know if you have heard and I'm sure your listeners who are pretty smart on this issue have heard about the Project for a New American Century, which was the sort of, successor to that small project that was happening in the White House or in the administration. And, you probably recognize names like Bill Kristol, and of course, Scooter Libby and Richard Pearl. and others of who were really leading the charge. And basically, they had the same idea that the United States was going to be a forward-facing force of stabilizing the Middle East, but it would need to do it sometimes with military force and create all of these lily pads, so to speak, of security throughout the Middle East, and have troops and have rapid reaction forces. And this kind of settled in this milieu in Washington, in which these very active and influential folks who were coming out of places like SAIS and getting jobs in the Clinton administration at that point, where they were able to actually try to put some of this stuff into action. One of the first things that they wanted to do was get rid of Saddam Hussein. And so there was an active effort, and they were pretty successful in ceding this ground, basically during the Clinton administration, by getting him to sign a directive of regime change. And I think most people forget that now, or people who weren't really just as steeped in this as, say, I was at the time, that the toppling of the Saddam Hussein regime, the Ba'athist regime, really started in the Clinton administration, with these neoconservatives really at the apex of their influence, were able to convince the Clinton that this guy needed to go. They largely saw that George Bush didn't complete the job in 1991 in the first Persian Gulf War, and made these arguments. And then they started finding people like Ahmed Talibi inside of Iraq to convince Washington that there was a government in waiting there, that once Saddam was toppled, that there was an administration, or there were folks there who would easily slip into control in Iraq, and everything would be great, and that they would have had taken out a sort of piece on the chessboard that was troublesome to their overall project, which was quote unquote stabilizing the Middle East. They worked very closely with Israel on these plans, because the idea was, and this was all borne out in briefs and in New York Times op-eds over the years, that to stabilize the Middle East, you had to sort of like get rid of Israel's enemies, because they were the ones that were causing the most trouble. And so there was a very close contact between the United States and Israel on this, and or influencers, or folks within the national security realm working together, so that when 9/11 happened, and I'm not the only one to say it, this actually delivered the best opportunity for the project of new American security and their adherents to really set these plans into motion. And I believe the rest is history.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, you're not the one to say it, because they obviously put it in their project for American, so PNAC document, sorry, rebuilding America's defenses, where they say, to have this sort of presence in the Middle East, there needs to be some sort of catastrophic event like Pearl Harbor, and
right,
a year or two later they get that, and that obviously gives them the justification they need to obviously do this. So you obviously, before we get onto maybe some of the actual architects other than Bush and Cheney in the administration, so you kind of touched on it there, but what is their obsession with Saddam Hussein, specifically? Because as you said, throughout the 90s and Clinton's years, they sent that letter to him. I think it was either one or two, where they're saying, you need to go beyond the sanctions, beyond, bombing. You need to actually overthrow them. And you have, I think, like 25 signatories on that. You can read all of their names. Right. And as you said, in 1998, he signs the regime change law, and, amount of funding goes towards opposition groups, and, it becomes kind of in writing the official policy. But what is their obsession with Saddam Hussein specifically? Because obviously in the 80s, he is our ally against Iran, or at least part of, the administration's ally, because you have Iran-Contra, but, mostly we wanted him to win rather than Iran. So what is their obsession with Iraq and Saddam Hussein specifically?
I'm not an expert on this. So in general, I think what I have come to believe is that he just fell out of favor with the Washington foreign policy establishment because he wasn't towing the line, and they've become big enemies of Israel, and decided to pursue a chemical weapons program. Had been actually at some point, Saddam Hussein was using chemical weapons against the Kurds, which of course had been partners of the neoconservatives and of the United States too. And so I think it was a culmination of a loss of trust. It was the 1991 Persian Gulf War, where these neocons felt like Bush didn't finish the job. They felt like that Saddam Hussein should not just be put in his place, but he should have been taken out of authority, that the Ba'athist regime should be shut down. He didn't do that. And so I think whether one was the justification for the other, I couldn't tell you, but I think there was a culmination of just that he wasn't playing nice anymore, and specifically wasn't helpful. And the overall project that we mentioned to quote unquote stabilize the Middle East, which meant keeping certain powers, whether it be U.S. and Israel and their friends, in a more predominant position in the region. And Saddam Hussein was just foiling, in their mind, those plans. And so he had been pretty much in the sights from the late 80s. And by the time 9/11 happened, there was enough brief built up against him over weapons of mass destruction, the gassing of the Kurds, the Ba'athist regime in general. And by that time, most Americans basically believed the brief against him. Now, not all of us believed that it was enough for us to invade the country, but by that time, he was considered an evil person, a dictator who did not care about his people, that was a threat to his neighbors. And that pretty much was enough for this group of neocons to start building the case for invasion.
Yeah, no, I always find it really hard to get my head around, like reading, through the Iran-Iraq war. You have Donald Rumsfeld, famous photo of him shaking hands, where like we're going to try and normalize relations. A lot of European companies, American companies, that's where a lot of the chemical weapons and stuff are coming from, in their own, the American documents. And he's our ally, you could justify, against an enemy, Iran. Obviously, the Shah just been overthrown. But then even just before the Gulf War, you had a national directive from George H.W. Bush, even after the Iran-Iraq war, just before the Gulf War, saying they could still, basically be a partner, and we're still willing to sell them certain military equipment and training. And then, a few months later, he's Hitler and it's the Gulf War, and he did all these horrible things, even though, we was obviously party to that and carried on. But, that's a whole nother story. I always just find it really strange how it flipped, so big. Yeah. And then the sanctions, calls for regime change, and then eventually, the invasion. So, you've talked a bit, obviously, about the neocons. So obviously when, an administration goes to war, you think of the president, like George Bush and Cheney. But so you've mentioned a few, but who were the kind of true architects in the administration that were kind of pushing the most for the war? And then, after that, we'll actually pose you a question about George Bush and kind of his own, was he pulled into this, or was he kind of up for himself? But outside of Cheney and Bush, who were some of the people pushing kind of the hardest for this in and outside of the administration?
Yeah, I mean, I think about Donald Rumsfeld. I think about, because I look at Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, and I say, they are not your classic neocons. They are not ideologues who had been sort of steeped in the academic and political culture of Washington, just waiting to unleash their brand of foreign policy onto the world. These guys are former businessmen, politicians. They are movers, they're shakers, they're political animals. But I think what happened was they came into office in 2000 with the new Bush administration, and they'd already been part of, and would have pursued a very aggressive, hawkish foreign policy with or without 9/11. I firmly believe that. The funny thing is, and it's not that funny, but George Bush won in part, on this, and I remember this now because this was such at the time was such a turning point election between Al Gore and George Bush. But George Bush had spoke about and I don't think he called it Jacksonian at the time, but he had talked about a more restrained foreign policy and sort of turning, more inward and taking care of our problems here in the United States and not engaging in nation building abroad. That all went out the window after 9/11, and folks like Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld really were ascendant in pursuing a more aggressive response to those attacks on September 11th. But without them, I don't think the neoconservatives would have been able to exact their plans in the way that they did. We mentioned Paul Wolfowitz. He was a key member of this team, and he had already been inside government during the first Bush administration. He was already trying to pursue this defense planning guidance that I mentioned and its successor plans, the toned down plans. But, basically they had foreseen a world in which preventative warfare was the norm. And I think they called it, and I'm looking at an article that my colleague Jim Loeb had written a few years back on the anniversary, that military dominance of virtually all of Eurasia could be achieved by, quote, deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role, and preempting, using whatever means necessary, states believed to be developing weapons of mass destruction. So it was a very proactive plan. And 9/11 really allowed people like Paul Wolfowitz, who I feel were a lot more ideological than Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld, to see these plans through. Now, folks on the outside, and of course they had a lot of help on the inside from people like Richard Pearl, who became an advisor, John Bolton, who was in the State Department during the Bush administration, Elliot Abrams, who we know, who was, he comes from the Reagan administration and had actually been convicted under the Iran-Contra affair. You had Douglas Feith and David Wormser, who were in Dick Cheney's little inner sanctum, who were actually hammering out the policy for these neocons. So you had a number of people who were right there in the inner sanctum. They were writing and delivering the policy, and then they were giving that policy to complicit media compradors outside to sell the policy. And that, along with your think tank types like Robert Kagan, all of the Kagans, really, Bill Kristol, a number of people that they're, David Frum, all of, their names almost in the mist of time now, who are working for think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute, in which that's where most of the neocons were perched at the time. And they were able to pump out briefs. They were holding panels. They were doing media all the time. And so you had this real ecosystem between the sort of intelligentsia outside and the media working with the neoconservative policymakers, churning out what turned out to be a policy for intervention in Iraq and maybe even and beyond, as well as this broader idea of interventionist preventative war policy. They're trying to normalize that with the American people, using 9/11, as, like you said, the catastrophic event to justify all of it. But it took a lot of people, and there were tons of folks in the media and academia who were not neoconservative by any stretch, but jumped on the bandwagon because they felt that was, quote, the right thing to do, but also there was a peer pressure to go along with all of this. There was a peer and a career pressure to go along with all of this. Not so different from today, where there's a career and peer pressure to think one way about the Ukraine war, for example. It's part of the hive-like groupthink atmosphere that always occurs around these wars, but it was very potent after 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, you're probably right. Cheney and Rumsfeld are kind of in a different category, and everyone kind of can have their own agenda. But with the neocons, so the other day, if people aren't familiar, I think a year or two ago, Scott Horton debated Bill Kristol, and I watched it again for the second time the other day. And it's really interesting because, in their papers, not maybe him specifically, but it kind of talks about the American empire dominance. We need to be in the Middle East. We need this justification. We can't let anyone basically beat us. But then, all they ever do, what he did was talk about, this could have been the first democracy in the Middle East and all this stuff. When they're saying things like that, not all of them, because, some of them maybe are more ideologues. Do they believe in that at all, or is that kind of just the public face of it to justify the other side of it?
Do they believe in what?
So when they're saying, we're doing this because we want the first, democracy in the Middle East and things like that, is that just something they say to make it not sound like it's purely about kind of building the American empire?
I never underestimate ideology in any of this, because I think you can be very cynical on one hand and say nobody believes that this is all about autocracies versus democracies. And we see that argument being rolled out today with the Ukraine war, and with people positioning themselves for or against, a protracted war there, or a continued American military support for that war. I do believe in my heart that there are folks out there who actually have this. They believe that what they're doing and what they're supporting is on the principle of seeing democracy spread to other countries that don't have it yet, and they feel like the United States has a obligation to promote democracy and progressive values, even if that means at the butt of a gun. And this is a contentious debate between folks like myself, who really do identify with many of those values of democracy and equality, all of the values that I feel had been imbued in our own Constitution at the founding. But I also stop when I see that these values or these missions have to be promoted with military force, or they don't work. And I feel like there were plenty of people after 9/11 who really believed that we were on some sort of messianic mission to spread liberty and democracy and freedom to the Iraqi people. And they really bought into that. I can't speak, and I can't look into the souls of Richard Pearl or Douglas Feith or Donald Rumsfeld or any of these people who literally crafted these interventionist policies. I feel there's probably a mix of motivations there, and I know I'm being kind. I feel like it took all types for them to see the invasion of Iraq through. So they needed the buy-in from just regular Americans, the United States media, the international community, the liberal establishment. They needed the buy-in from the liberal establishment. So how do they do that? They basically tell them that this is part of the American mission, something that Woodrow Wilson saw at the dawn of World War I, his progressive vision to help spread our values to other nations. And they bought into it. Now, whether the guys at the top were doing it for other purposes that were more about geopolitics or Israel or primacy, U.S. primacy and empire, I'm not in a good position to say what was in each person's mind and heart. But I think like I said, I think it took all types to make what they did successful. And when I say successful, meaning that this invasion actually happened in the first place.
Yeah, no, that's probably a fair kind of summary of that. I mean, it's always hard to see it as we want to do this for democracy, and then our biggest allies, dictatorships in the Gulf or Africa, wherever it is. But that's always, that's justified for these reasons. And like the British, obviously I'm from the UK, all the time they're like, well, we can use our relationship with the Saudis and, other countries in the Gulf, so we can lean on them to, call them out on their human rights. And, Liz Truss, before she was Prime Minister, I can't remember her exact position, but she was getting questioned on it about, when was the last time you actually spoke about human rights? Because she was denouncing Russia and China, and the guy actually calls her out and says, well, when was the last time, you called out the Saudis about, Jamal Khashoggi or capital punishment they had, and she couldn't give a single example, like not one where she's actually said it. It's just something they kind of seem to say, like, oh, we can
exactly
use our liberal influence on them. And then when she was actually asked, no joke, she couldn't. She was like, oh, I'll get someone to send it over after. He's like, oh, can you not come up with one time you've ever called them out?
You said you were talking about authoritarian regimes earlier, and you've said that the UK should be a robust counterweight to authoritarian regimes, and that we are ending our dependency on authoritarian regimes for energy. How would you describe the Gulf states?
I would describe the Gulf states as partners of the United Kingdom. We're currently negotiating a trade deal with the GCC. Now, is every country that we work with exactly in line with United Kingdom policy on everything? No, they're not, but they are important allies of the United Kingdom.
Hang on, Mohammed bin Salman, responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, no? Yeah?
What I would say is that Saudi Arabia is an important partner of the United Kingdom.
81 executions all on one day in Saudi Arabia, and you don't think that that's an authoritarian regime?
What I'm focused on is making sure that we are dealing with the major threats to the world. The number one threat we're dealing with at the moment is the threat from Russia. In order to do that, we need to make sure that we have alternative energy sources. And one of the key sources of energy is the Gulf region. We're not dealing in a perfect world. We're dealing in a world where we need to make difficult decisions. And I think it is right that we build that closer trading relationship with the Gulf states.
If a country is an authoritarian regime, it's fine to do business with it as long as the authoritarianism is only within its own borders. Is that right?
What we're facing with Russia is a regime that is actively seeking to invade sovereign nations and create a greater Russia, recreate the former Soviet Union. What we're seeing with China...
Yeah, but we went hand in cap to them for 12 years, and now
wrong.
We're doing the same with Saudi Arabia.
Well, I think that was wrong, the approach that was taken
to
Russia by the West. it was wrong.
In the Gulf trade document that you just published, you say the government will continue to hold those who violate human rights to account. How are you doing that in the Gulf states at the moment?
Well, these issues are raised regularly with the relevant ministers and leaders who we meet in the Gulf states.
You
and
have
what
personally?
our aim, I have personally, yes.
Well, your spokesman said that you hadn't. So what's the last human rights issue that you raised with a Gulf state leader?
I'd have to come back to the committee on the precise timing of that, but I certainly
anything.
have
Just
raised
tell us
it.
anything that you've said on
well,
human rights.
I certainly have raised it when I was in...
Go on, tell us one now.
I'm just trying to remember my most recent visit, but I can assure you I have raised it, and I will write to you with the details.
You can't remember a single human rights issue that you've raised with a Gulf state leader?
Oh, I've raised particular issues when I've been in the Gulf about
name
human
one.
rights issues. Well, I'm not going to go into all the details of private conversations, which I will come back to you on in due course.
I'll name one.
You know, there may be some inklings that they think, well, maybe we could do this for geopolitical reasons, but you know, maybe it would be nice to spread democracy if they do believe in that. And again, this may again lean on speculation, so you might have a similar answer. But you know, where do you think George Bush lies in the blame? You know, because obviously he can't be innocent, even if he is swayed by all of this. He is still the president, and the buck stops obviously with the president. What do you think his motivations were? Do you think before 9/11 because you know, people kind of talk about as soon as this administration was formed, Iraq was kind of the talking subject. So do you think he was caught up in 9/11, all these figures, or was he kind of on board with this and then ultimately pushed over? Where do you kind of, I guess, see him in on this scale? Again, I know you have to speculate.
Yeah, I totally have to speculate. And I think I'm going to take a very broad generalization approach to it. I mean, having lived through and in my career as a member of the media through that election and watching him very closely throughout, you know, daily in terms of how he was conducting himself as a president before, during, and after 9/11. I mean, I think I would take a slightly more sympathetic view. I think he was over his head. Sorry, I believe he was over his head from the absolute beginning. I feel like his entire presidency was somewhat of a confection. I think his younger brother, Jeb, was probably in a better position in terms of his leadership and governance to run for president. I feel like there was a dynastic element to him running in the first place. We know the stories. Anybody who's followed that particular election, you know that Karl Rove and others had been sort of put into place to help him run, to get him through the primaries and the election, and he won. And he wasn't particularly masterful at speaking, or didn't have an extraordinary record as governor of Texas. What he had was absolute huge name recognition as a Bush, and he had a folksy demeanor that really spoke to people, particularly right of center. Liberals and Democrats absolutely hated him. They mocked him, which kind of made him a little bit more sympathetic, actually. The media has not changed. It's always been very pro-liberal establishment, and they hate Republicans. And I say that as a member of media in good standing for almost 30 years. So I don't say that lightly. And so every chance they had, they made fun of this guy for being out of his head, for not being able to deliver remarks without messing up words, mispronouncing words. I mean, it was kind of the progenitor of Trump. Trump doesn't care, and he actively trolls the media. Bush didn't actively troll the media. They basically just they tore him to pieces on a daily basis. Then 9/11 happens, and I feel like he immediately was pressured to surround himself with people who knew what they were doing in national security and foreign policy. And he chose, for whatever reason, I wasn't there, he chose to put Dick Cheney basically in charge of marshaling the sort of brain trust that was going to help get the United States through this time and react to it. And I feel, and this isn't a novel idea, that if he had leaned more on his father's generation, who were more, Cold War, old hands, more realist in their foreign policy approach, I think things might have been a little different. Can't really prove that. So he leaned on the neoconservatives, who were ascendant at the time. They were young, they were hungry, they were influential, and they were ready to leap into action. And so, yeah, I blame him because he didn't have the tools to rebuff some of these more aggressive people in his administration. He leaned too much on Dick Cheney. He allowed Dick Cheney to basically open up his own shop within the Pentagon through Rumsfeld and in the National Security Council, and basically populate it with a bunch of warmongering neoconservatives. So Bush said he was the decider, and so we have to blame him. I just think that it's complicated, and I do think that there are, if we're on a scale of like the evil scale 1 to 5, I think there are folks who rise to that level of being really evil over George Bush, who I think was out of his league. And people mock him now because he paints pictures and he's hanging out on his ranch, and he makes declarations every once in a while about Trump and what's going on in the world. But I do think that what happened really took its toll on him, and he probably has way more regrets than any of these other souls that he had in his administration, who were responsible for what happened.
Yeah,
that's
again,
just me. That's just it's just me after 20 years of letting it all settle in. And if you had asked me this question 15 years ago, I might have been spitting fire about George Bush. I just think that there were much more nefarious types around him that need to be called out for their roles. And a lot of them have been able to sort of slink away. Some of them have more class to not pop up on Twitter and other places and try to engage in current foreign policy debates. Like, I don't see Paul Wolfowitz around anymore. But I do see Bill Kristol everywhere, and I see Bill Kristol raising money, against Trump, and he just launched a new campaign called Republicans for Ukraine. And I wish he and others like David Frum would just go away, because they are responsible for the lives of so many Iraqis, for the lives of so many American soldiers. The impact on families and communities, and for them to march around talking about how terrible Donald Trump is all the time, as though Donald Trump is actually going to destroy democracy every day. And it makes me cringe, because I don't know what's worse than starting a war over nothing and watching the entire Middle East go up in flames like it did in 2003.
Yeah, no, that was actually going to be one of my next questions, but just kind of what you were just saying there. Yeah, again, you can only really speculate about George Bush, and he did kind of probably disappear after Iraq, unlike kind of Tony Blair, who's probably more hated than Bush. Like when Tony Blair, he was knighted this year, and they did it January. They did it literally straight after New Year's Eve. They obviously tried to sneak it in because they know he's a pretty hated guy. And because I brought it up on another show I had, and I looked, and there was an article. It was literally, I think, a week after he was knighted, and there was a petition. 1 million people had already signed it within a week to get it taken away. Tony Blair is more hated. One, because I think, 9/11 happened in America, you know, the feeling in America, again, I was like, I was barely alive, so I don't know, but obviously it was completely different in Europe to America, you know, what happened after 9/11. And Tony Blair kind of had more freedom to do kind of what he wanted. Obviously, there's always the pressure of backing America, which he did in, you know, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. But after, you know, he came out of office after 10 years, he then goes on to, you know, make millions, and he's still floating around now, piping up. You know, when Russia invaded Ukraine, he did an interview with The Economist where he's calling out Putin. Not once did they actually bring up Iraq. I was like, I'm just going to watch it just to see if they brought it up. Don't bring it up at all. And I mean, kind of a side note to this, but it's actually quite interesting that when Putin was coming to power, there's actually an article in the Times, not the New York Times, the London Times, where it talks about how MI6 basically said sorry for helping Putin to get elected. Basically, the KGB or whatever version it was then came to Tony Blair's administration to basically ask if they could, you know, help him get elected. Basically, and MI6 set up a meeting, and you can see it just before the elections. Blair is with Putin in St. Petersburg. And there's literally articles all the time. It's quite interesting. And then, you know, BP got a lot of oil drilling deals. But anyway, that's kind of a tangent. I've gone off there. But yeah, so that was kind of my next question. You kind of started talking about different people there. So most of the people involved, did they kind of disappear from the scenes on the political side? You know, because I was kind of going to ask you the other side of it as well, in the media, where some of these figures are obviously quite still swimming around, have even been kind of promoted. So since the invasion and after, you know, where have a lot of the figures in the media and political system gone? You know, feel free to pick who you kind of want.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Bill Kristol and David Frum, who basically have reinvented themselves as never Trumpers. So they're just so absolutely appalled with the rise of Donald Trump, who he's an anathema to neoconservatism, in that he rose through the ranks in the 2016 election by calling the Iraq War one of the greatest failures of U.S. foreign policy of all time, if not the biggest failure. He called George Bush a liar. He brought out the fact that there was no weapons of mass destruction. He talked about all of the regime change wars of the preceding years, the preceding decades, and how it hadn't like moved the needle forward in terms of actually making the world more secure. He talked about rolling back all of these wars. He talked about bringing troops home from Afghanistan. He talked about no more nation building. This was 180 degrees opposite than the PNAC vision of this proactive U.S. primacy to control events in the Middle East and beyond. And so right from the bat, they didn't like this guy. He was not their kind of Republican. And you saw all of them, to a person, turn against Donald Trump and start supporting Democrats, popping up in the pages of the Washington Post. You have Jennifer Rubin and Max Boot, who had been major cheerleaders of the Iraq War and the neoconservative vision throughout all of the global war on terror. You suddenly saw them gaining audience at the Washington Post, and they're now regular columnists. And because they turned against Donald Trump, and then somehow that they became acceptable to the liberal establishment mainstream. David Frum, who coined the axis of evil during the Bush administration, calling out North Korea, Iran, and Iraq as the axis of evil. Now is basically building his own fortunes by writing books about Donald Trump and how awful. Oh, and yes, there was that little thing about the Iraq War, and the Americans are really upset, but now democracy is at risk, and we got to fight for it here in the United States. And it's just, it's a lot of audacity. And there are plenty of other people like the Kagan family that I mentioned. David Petraeus and Frederick Kagan, which is Robert Kagan's brother, just had a article or an op-ed in the Washington Post in which they're pretty much like pulling a redux of their previous surge portrayal, or I hate to not give context, but David Petraeus and Frederick Kagan were the main architects of the surge in Iraq. Well, we'll just put 200,000 more troops in Iraq and Afghanistan later, and everything will be fine. And now, 20 years later, they're saying, well, we just continue to give Ukraine everything they need, more sophisticated weapons, and everything will be fine. So it's like part two of the surge, 15, 20 years later. Somehow we're being asked to believe these guys, that somehow that they are voices for the new generation of national security and foreign policy. But there you are, they're at the top of the Washington Post. So a lot of these people have never been held accountable for what they did during the global war on terror. They are still marketing themselves as experts. And as long as the Washington Post and the New York Times and PBS and CNN and MSNBC and even Fox News, who has John Bolton on regularly and other hawks from that era, as long as they're still willing to put them in a chair in front of a camera, they're still with us. And so it's up to people like me and you to keep calling them out when they do pop up. And as we saw in the Republican debate the other night, these hawks like Pence, former Vice President Mike Pence and Nikki Haley, they are still regurgitating all of that post 9/11 nostalgia, and they're overlaying it on to the Ukraine war. Luckily, Trump and other Republicans, populist Republicans, aren't buying that. And so you have some, real pushback in the Republican Party right now. But I have to say, that hawkish neoconservative view is still pretty predominant, at least on Capitol Hill. I don't think it's selling in the American public.
Yeah, that was actually going to be one of my questions, but I just realized why I went on that rant about Tony Blair, because in the 2000s, it was when Russia kind of had that conflict, obviously, in Chechnya. And at that time, we didn't care. And then he does an interview when they invade Ukraine, when they're no longer our ally, and then he calls them out. That was the reason I went on the rant.
Good point.
And am I correct? One of the Kagans, is it Robert Kagan, is the husband of Victoria Nuland?
Yes.
And then you have people
it's a family affair.
And then you have people like Anne Applebaum in the Atlantic Council, or the Atlantic, who's wife of the Polish MEP who posted that picture on Twitter saying thank you USA when most likely the US bombed the Nord Stream pipeline, or at least according to him.
Right. And then to take it further, Kimberly Kagan, who's married to Fred Kagan, brother of Robert Kagan, who are sons of Yale historian Donald Kagan, is the founder and I believe still the director of the Institute for the Study of War, which is consistently quoted and cited as a primary source of news on battlefield news and mapping in Ukraine. And so if you look and you do a quick Google search, Institute for the Study of War, what you'll get is numerous quotations and sourcing in the Washington Post, New York Times. All the major newspapers go to ISW for all their battlefield analysis, which is heavily skewed for Ukraine and against Russia. Now, on the face of it, you say, well, Ukraine's the good guys and the Russians the bad guys. But when you have what is supposed to be independent analysis of what is actually going on the ground, and the media is using that information to make analysis and to share it with the American people. You want it not to be biased. And Robert Wright, who is a wonderful media critic and an author, has called them out more than once. And he says, listen, it's not about taking sides. This is about, if you're going to present yourself as an expert on military strategy and analysis, you need to check your biases at the door, and the media needs to look at who they're quoting. And if you have somebody like Kimberly Kagan, who started this shop during the global war on terror as a way to basically push and promote a particular brand of military assessment, and now they are the primary source for the media on Ukraine, there's something wrong there. The media at least should be cognizant of these existing biases before they deliver this up as like objective analysis to the American people. But just to get back, so that is like, what, 4 or 5 Kagans that are intimately involved in shaping the narrative, whether it be in Iraq or Afghanistan and now Ukraine and Russia. I mean, it's amazing, but I'm glad that you're pointing it out with your show, because I think the more that people know that there are these connections and there's these existing conflicts of interest, the more that we can be informed about how we feel about these wars and what our governments, yours and mine, are doing in our name.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the equivalent back in the day would kind of be like banking and oil, where you have like the Rockefellers, and they each have like 5, 6 kids, and they're just swimming around, and they can open their own think tanks, and they're just swimming around kind of everywhere. And as you said, the British media are quite similar. They will reference RUSI or Chatham House. Again, just like the American think tanks, you can look at the British ones, the Australian ones, whatever it is. It's
right,
the same,
exactly.
Same people back in, not like the equivalent, literally the same companies, the same oil companies, the same governments, all just funding them. Same corporations too.
Right.
British or American think tank, or I can't remember the Australian one. It's just all the same people, and they quote them in their article, and then they don't let oh, by the way, the people who are maybe encouraging the counteroffensive in Ukraine are actually people who are going to directly benefit from it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so just to kind of not finish up quite yet, still got 10 more minutes, 5 more minutes. So how would you kind of differ the media and political environment today, kind of probably around Ukraine, maybe China more, maybe because Ukraine's kind of more ongoing, and the environment in Iraq 2003? Has it worsened, or has it become better in the media and the political system, or is it just quite similar?
I think it's a mixed bag, or a mixed picture. I feel like the same pressures are on media and commentators to conform to a specific point of view on this war, and that specific point of view is to be pro-Ukraine without question, give them all that they need, no condition, completely unfettered. It's all about democracies and autocracies. If you don't support them full-throatedly, somehow that you are mimicking or parroting the Russian line. Somehow you're not for democracy, you're for authoritarians. I feel that pressure exists, and it's pretty strong. And it's strong because, as an editor of an online magazine, I've noticed over the last couple years that as we're getting more traffic to our website, a lot of it's because people aren't finding what they need elsewhere, because the media landscape for foreign policy analysis is dominated by the establishment point of view, and dissent has been highly killed, whether it be in the mainstream media, or newspapers, social media, and the like, and television. At the same time, there are so many more alternate platforms for news and views than there were back in 2002, even 2010. During the war, blogs were the big thing, and everybody had a blog. But guess what? It was just like high school. If you had the right connections, you had somebody bankrolling your blog was linked to another major newspaper or outlet. Guess what? Everybody was reading you because they were being directed to you. And most of those blogs, I would say 99%, were in favor of Washington's war policies on some level. Or they just didn't really engage at all. And so, yeah, blogs became an alternative media source, but they quickly got co-opted by the groupthink in Washington. So it was very frustrating as a reporter myself to find outlets to write for, so I can express my outrage and in my own way with the war, because there was a massive gatekeeping function going on. And so that's why I started writing at antiwar.com and then the American Conservative. Today, I feel like you have Substack, you have the social media is this like Wild West landscape. You have YouTube, you have people being able to make, and put out their own podcasts. 10 years ago, you literally had to go into a studio and you had to hire a producer, and there was a whole cottage industry for podcasting. And then people realized, no, I can do this forever and I can do it myself. And I don't need to pay a consultant $5,000 a month to put a podcast. As things became more egalitarian in that way, then so points of view are different points of view are more acceptable and heard. Then on the other hand, we have a massive censorship regime that has sprout up during the whole Russiagate thing. And so you do have private and public entities who are pouring money into finding ways to shut down speech. And we've saw that with the Twitter files, and we see that with a lot of the great reporting that's been coming out by Ken Klippenstein and others, Matt Taibbi, who are showing that there is an enormous, I don't know what you would call it. It's just an ecosystem of nefarious organizations that are working with the government to make sure that you and I aren't talking about the things that we're talking about. So I don't know what to tell you, Louis. I feel like there's some things that are better today, and some things that are like a lot more scary in terms of the First Amendment and free speech and all. I would say that, me writing for a magazine that's completely dedicated to sticking a finger in the eye of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, Responsible Statecraft, which is part of the Quincy Institute, which did not exist 20 years ago and is doing really well. We're getting tremendous support from people. That tells me that we're an outlet for a lot of energy out there to create dissent, to push back, to accept what the blob has been shoveling at us for the last 20 years. So it's like I said, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, it's interesting for me. I'm 22, and obviously I'm coming from a UK or English perspective rather than American. But pretty much everyone I know in my age group just doesn't even read the news, and they don't really believe the media, but also they just actually don't. Even if they did, they just don't really seem to read the news. Obviously, there's the rise of social media. There still isn't a massive interest in, again, this is anecdotal from my friends and friends of friends who aren't really that interested in these topics, but they certainly don't really believe in the media. And even kind of my parents and some, your generation and their friends, even then, they're kind of done with the media. But then when big events do come, they do go there and still watch it because they're not really in the same world as us. Well, you can watch something on Rumble or BitChute or go to something like you. So they don't believe them, but then, when the time comes, they end up going there. And yeah, as you said, there's obviously the rise of, censorship. And then you have these tech companies who are direct, contractors with the military. The media, because it's compromised, but, some of these tech companies actually get contracts from the military, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Alphabet. But yeah, there's definitely something to be glad of. How a few years ago, someone kind of my age wouldn't be probably doing something like this unless they worked for a media organization. So there's definitely positives. There's more platforms, more are growing. Right. But I will have to kind of slow it down here. So just for the last question, I didn't ask you before. I really want to get in the habit of asking it kind of every interview. Just some book recommendations you have on the Iraq War. If you don't have any specifically on that, you could, do the War on Terror or just kind of US foreign policy specifically. But if you can do Iraq, that would be great, because I think books are just a great resource.
I would start with, oh God, there's so many. Okay, so you're putting me on the spot a little bit. But right off the top of my head, I would say anything by Jeremy Scahill and Scott Horton. Jeremy had, Scott's written about Afghanistan and the global war on terror, Jeremy as well. But Jeremy has this great book called Dirty Wars that covers everything that Blackwater and the rise of military mercenaries in use by the U.S. government from Iraq on. And it's a very thick read, but it's very intense. And, it focuses on the private military contractors, but to understand the madness of the war in Iraq and the global war on terror, you have to focus on the military industrial complex and the military contracting system, because billions, trillions of dollars were funneled into just a few major companies like Halliburton, formerly that was led by Dick Cheney, to do everything in that war. We would have been home in 2 years probably if we didn't have military contractors to rely on. But he takes it a step further, talking about like those that were actually in combat illegally, like Blackwater. He also did a book on, or maybe that's I'm confusing it. He did the book on Blackwater, and then Dirty Wars was the global war on terror all throughout Afghanistan and the Middle East, the counterterrorism element, the manhunting that went on, all in the shadows of public view. That was huge. And also Scott's book, and Michael Hastings, who's not with us anymore, wrote a great book called The Operators, which talked about the Afghanistan war. And I have to say there are so many books. So I'm in the show notes, I could give you a few more, but those are the ones that right off the top of the head that really illustrate the corruption of the U.S. war policy through specific, contexts, whether it be the generals, the U.S. military, counterterrorism, and the private military, the mercenary view.
Yeah, no, you're right. Sorry. Yeah, if you're happy to send any over, no rush. Just I'll put them in the show notes. You're right. There's so many different books. And yeah, you said a couple there from Jeremy Scahill, and he also has one I think on drones as well. He's got loads.
Yes.
But so I'll talk to you about that after. But yeah, I'd like to thank you for coming on again. Really enjoyed it as usual. I'd point people to your work at the Responsible Statecraft, at the Quincy Institute. I'll put it all in the show notes. I'll put it on the screen, and I'll link to a few of your recent articles or anything you've done recently you want me to after. But again, just a real thanks for coming on. I really enjoy listening to you, much like your Scott Horton interviews, which again, I'd encourage people to go to. But yeah, thank you for coming on again to speak about Iraq.
Thanks, Louis. I had a great time.
Thank you.